The courtroom was dead silent. Not the kind of quiet that comes from respect, the kind that comes from watching someone lose everything. Elena Marsh stood at the plaintiff's table, fingers gripping the edge so hard her knuckles had turned white. The jury had been deliberating for 6 hours. The judge had just walked back in. The verdict was seconds away. $300 million. Gone. A corporate fraud case that had taken her 4 years to build was about to collapse in front of everyone. And then, a hand touched her shoulder. Quiet, steady, calm. She turned around slowly. It was him, her driver, the old man who'd been sitting in the back row of the courtroom all week, the same man who picked her up every morning at 6 a.m. without a single word of complaint. He leaned forward, and in a voice barely above a whisper, he said just 3 words. Check page 47. Elena froze. What happened next didn't just save the case. It changed everything she thought she knew about the man who'd been driving her car for 2 years. Before we continue, if you love stories like this one, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications so you never miss a story like this again. And quickly, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are watching from right now. Now, let's get back to the story. Elena Marsh didn't come from money. She came from a 2-bedroom apartment in Detroit, a mother who worked double shifts at a hospital laundry, and a father she never met. She put herself through law school on scholarships and student loans, eating ramen 4 nights a week, sleeping 3 hours a night, telling herself over and over again, one day it will matter. And it did. By the time Elena was 38, she was one of the most feared corporate litigators in the country. Not the flashiest, not the most famous, but the one that opposing counsel quietly dreaded, the one companies hired when they were truly desperate. She had an 87% win rate. She had a corner office on the 42nd floor of a Manhattan skyscraper. She had a reputation built on one thing. She never, ever gave up on a case. But this case was trying to break her. The defendant was Hargrove Capital, a $4 billion investment firm that had spent the last decade systematically stealing from pension funds, retirement savings, teachers, firefighters, ordinary people who had worked their entire lives and trusted the wrong company with their futures. The lead partner at Hargrove was a man named Douglas Vane. Douglas Vane was everything Elena was not. Born wealthy, educated at the finest schools, photographed at galas, friends with senators. He had the kind of smile that made people trust him instantly, the kind of confidence that made ordinary people feel small just by being in the same room. He had also, Elena was absolutely certain, stolen over $300 million. The problem was proving it. The original case had been built 4 years ago by a whistleblower inside Hargrove Capital, someone who had seen everything, someone who had documented every transaction, every falsified report, every shell company used to hide the money. That whistleblower had come forward quietly, handed everything to the SEC, named names, provided dates, built what investigators called, at the time, the most airtight financial fraud case we've ever seen. And then, he disappeared. Not figuratively. Literally disappeared. Martin Cole, former CFO of Hargrove Capital, had simply vanished. His car was found near the Hudson River. His wallet was found on the river bank. The official conclusion, eventually, was death by drowning. No body was ever recovered. The case was ruled a suicide. And without Martin Cole's testimony, without his physical presence to authenticate the documents, to walk the jury through the financial architecture he had personally constructed, the case began to fall apart. By the time Elena inherited the file, after 2 other attorneys had already walked away from it, the evidence trail had been systematically picked apart by Hargrove's legal team. Witnesses had recanted, documents had been challenged, 3 key pieces of financial data had been ruled inadmissible. She had almost nothing left. But she took the case anyway, because she believed Martin Cole, even if he was dead. The first thing Elena did when she took the Hargrove case was hire a driver. She wasn't the type. She'd always driven herself everywhere, practical, independent, no patience for luxury. But the case demanded 18-hour days, and she couldn't afford to be distracted behind the wheel, not when she was mentally reconstructing financial trails at midnight. The agency sent her a man named George. Just George. He'd filled out the paperwork with only a first name and a former occupation listed as finance. The agency said he was retired, early 60s, clean record, quiet, reliable. Elena barely noticed him at first. He was just there. Every morning at 6 a.m., engine running, coffee already in the cup holder, black, 2 sugars, exactly how she took it, though she'd never told him. He didn't make small talk, he didn't ask questions, he just drove. And sometimes when she was muttering case details to herself in the back seat, going over testimony, arguing with herself about strategy, she'd catch him glancing in the rearview mirror. Not intrusively, just listening. She thought nothing of it. She had a case to save. The opposing legal team was led by a man named Carter Webb, Hargrove's head attorney and one of the most ruthless defense lawyers in corporate law. Carter was brilliant, well-resourced, and completely without conscience. He had a team of 30 attorneys, 3 forensic accountants, and what she was increasingly certain was a source inside the court system feeding him information. How else to explain it? Every time Elena found a new angle, Carter already had a counter prepared. Every time she located a new witness, they were either unavailable or had already been deposed by Hargrove's team and somehow changed their story. One morning, 2 weeks before trial, Elena arrived at her office to find that her paralegal, a young woman named Dana who had been working the Hargrove case with her for 2 years, had submitted her resignation. No explanation. Just a letter on the desk and an empty chair. Elena stared at that empty chair for a long moment. Then she picked up her files and kept working. The trial began on a Monday in October. By Wednesday, it was clear Elena was losing. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the slow, suffocating way that experienced litigators feel before the jury does, like water rising inch by inch in a sealed room. Carter Webb was masterful. He reframed every piece of evidence Elena presented. He made the pension fund victims seem like they'd made poor investment choices. He made Douglas Vane seem like a man who had been let down by his own employees, not a predator who had engineered a theft. And he kept coming back to the same point, over and over. The only person who truly claimed to understand how these transactions were structured was Martin Cole. And Martin Cole is dead. Everything else before you is speculation, interpretation, and assumption. The jury believed him. Elena could see it in their faces. By Friday, she was running out of time and almost out of moves. That Friday evening, George picked her up outside the courthouse. She got in the car without a word, sat back, closed her eyes. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Then George spoke, and it was so unexpected, so out of character, that Elena opened her eyes immediately. How did it go today? She looked at him in the mirror. He was watching the road, expression neutral, but there was something in the question. Not casual, not polite, something careful. Not well, she said. He nodded slowly. They're going to win, aren't they? He said. It wasn't a question. Probably, Elena admitted. Another long silence. And then George said something very strange. Do you have all of Martin Cole's original materials, everything he submitted to the SEC before he disappeared? Elena frowned. Why? Just, do you have them? All of them, including the preliminary documents, the ones submitted before the formal filing. Yes, she said slowly. They're in a binder back at the office, but they've been gone over 100 times. There's nothing new there. George nodded again, said nothing more, and Elena, exhausted and defeated, let it go. She shouldn't have. The weekend brought no relief. Elena worked through both days reviewing testimony transcripts, looking for inconsistencies she could exploit on Monday. She found a few small ones, nothing game-changing, the kind of minor contradictions that make an attorney feel like she's doing something without actually changing the trajectory of a trial. Sunday night, she couldn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table at 2 a.m., surrounded by documents, staring at the photo she kept in the file, the only photo she had of Martin Cole, a company headshot, professional, formal. The face of a man in his mid-50s, gray at the temples, eyes that seemed, even in a photograph, like they were watching you closely. He saw everything, she thought. He documented everything. And then he just disappeared. She'd always believed Hargrove had him killed, made it look like a suicide, silenced the one person who could bring them down. But the official record said otherwise, and courts dealt in official records. Monday's session was brutal. Carter Webb spent the morning systematically dismantling Elena's final financial expert, a forensic accountant named Dr. Patricia Sung, who had spent 6 months analyzing the Hargrove transactions. He challenged her methodology, her credentials, her assumptions. He was methodical, relentless, and by the time the lunch recess came, Dr. Sung looked shaken. Elena sat alone in the courthouse hallway during lunch. She didn't eat. She just sat there with the binder of Martin Cole's original documents open on her lap, going through them for what felt like the 100th time. Page after page of financial records, shell company structures, transaction logs, annotated in Martin Cole's precise, careful handwriting. She'd been through every page so many times she could recite them. Almost every page. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Just 3 characters. P47. Elena stared at the message. Her mouth went dry. She turned to page 47. She'd seen page 47 before, or she thought she had. It was a single sheet, a preliminary transaction summary dated almost 5 years ago, before the formal SEC filing. She'd glanced at it early in her case review and moved on. It seemed redundant, a rough draft of information that appeared in cleaner form later in the document. But now, staring at it properly for the first time, really looking, she saw it. There was a column of figures on the right side of the page. 8 transactions, small amounts, the kind of thing that gets lost in documents involving billions of dollars. But the routing numbers were different. Not the shell companies Carter Webb had already successfully argued were legal, not the accounts that had been challenged and ruled inadmissible. These were different accounts entirely, accounts she had never seen before, accounts that appeared only on this single preliminary page that had never been properly analyzed because it seemed like a rough draft. Her hands were trembling. If these accounts were real, if these transactions could be traced, they led directly to Douglas Vane personally, not to Hargrove Capital, not to a subsidiary, not to a shell company, to Douglas Vane himself. This wasn't circumstantial. This was the entire case. She burst back into the courtroom 10 minutes before the afternoon session was due to start. George was in the back row, as always. Same quiet expression, same still posture. She stared at him. He looked back at her calmly. "You sent that text," she said quietly. He didn't deny it. "How did you know about page 47? He held her gaze. "Because I wrote it." The world tilted. Elena gripped the back of the nearest chair. "Because I wrote it." No, it couldn't be. Martin Cole was dead. She had the police report. She had the findings. She had 5 years of legal record confirming that the man who built this case had drowned in the Hudson River. "That's not possible," she whispered. "Elena." His voice was low, steady, and now that she was truly hearing it for the first time, there was something in it, an authority she'd never registered before. The voice of someone who had once stood in boardrooms. "There isn't time. Go back in there. Use the routing numbers on page 47. Get them into the record before Carter Webb realizes what you found. I'll explain everything afterward." She looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time she saw past the gray hair, the quiet demeanor, the invisible man persona that had made him so easy to overlook for 2 years. The eyes. The same eyes as the company headshot. The same eyes that had been watching her carefully every single morning in that rearview mirror. He'd been there the entire time. The judge walked in. All rise. Elena turned around, sat down, and for the most important 3 minutes of her entire legal career, she found her calm. Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption, but I need to introduce a line of questioning about a specific document already in evidence. Carter Webb was on his feet immediately. Objection. We are in the middle of redirect examination. It's a document already admitted, Your Honor. Page 47 of Exhibit 12, the preliminary Martin Cole SEC submission. Carter paused. For just one fraction of a second, barely visible, his composure flickered. He knew the document, of course he did. His team had reviewed everything, but Elena could see it in his face. He'd made the same assumptions she had. Rough draft, redundant, irrelevant. He hadn't looked closely enough. I'll allow it, the judge said. Proceed, counselor. Elena stood up. Her voice didn't shake. Dr. Sung, I'm directing your attention to the 8 transactions listed on page 47, specifically the routing numbers in the right-hand column. Can you confirm, are these routing numbers present anywhere else in the Hargrove financial documents we've reviewed? Dr. Sung studied the page. A long pause. No, she said slowly. These are different accounts. I haven't seen these before. Can you identify whose accounts these are? Another pause. Dr. Sung's eyes moved to the routing numbers. Her expression shifted, the careful, professional neutrality of a forensic accountant encountering something that genuinely surprises her. These accounts, she said carefully, are registered to an individual, not a corporate entity, a personal account. She looked up. Under the name Douglas Vane. The courtroom erupted. Douglas Vane, who had sat through the entire trial with the serene confidence of a man who had bought his way to safety, went completely still. Carter Webb was already moving, already objecting, already reaching for his notes. But it was too late. The routing numbers were in the record. The transactions were traceable. And for the first time in 4 years, the truth had somewhere to go. The jury deliberated for 45 minutes. They came back with a unanimous verdict. Douglas Vane was liable for $312 million in fraudulent misappropriation. Criminal charges were referred within the hour. Elena stood at the plaintiff's table as the verdict was read and felt, not triumph, not relief, just a deep, exhausted sense of rightness, like a long, broken bone finally setting properly. She turned around. The back row was empty. George was gone. She found him outside the courthouse. He was standing on the steps, looking out at the street, not hiding, not running, just standing there in the pale October light, with the quiet patience of a man who had waited a very long time and had nowhere left to hurry. Martin Cole, she said. He turned. I thought you should hear me say it properly, she said, before whatever comes next. He almost smiled. I wasn't sure you'd want to. You faked your death. Hargrove had people everywhere, he said simply. When I submitted those documents to the SEC, I knew within 48 hours that Vane knew. I had a choice. Disappear or actually disappear. A pause. I chose the version I could come back from. For 5 years you've been watching, he said, waiting, making sure it didn't die completely. The SEC case stalled. The first 2 attorneys gave up, but then you took it. He glanced at her. You were the first one who actually believed I existed. Elena was quiet for a moment. Page 47. Why did you wait so long? Because a document is only as good as the attorney presenting it, he said. I needed to know you were the right person. I watched you for 2 years, Elena. I watched how you handled pressure, how you handled betrayal, your paralegal, the witness recantations, everything Carter Webb threw at you. I needed to know you wouldn't fold at the critical moment. That's why you drove me. That's why I drove you." She looked at him for a long moment. "You were there the whole time," she said softly. "Every single morning. Every single morning." The news broke within hours. Martin Cole, former Hargrove Capital CFO, believed dead since 2019, alive. Key witness in landmark fraud case. The story was everywhere by evening. Not just the verdict, not just the $312 million judgment, but him, the man who had built the case, faked his death, and then spent 5 years driving the attorney who would finally finish the job. Carter Rebb's law firm issued a statement saying they had been unaware of any improper conduct and were reviewing their representation. Douglas Fain was arrested at his Connecticut estate at 7:30 that evening. He said nothing as the handcuffs went on, but a photographer caught his face in that moment. The face of a man who had believed, absolutely, that he had won, and that photograph was on every front page the next morning. The pension fund victims were notified within a week. Teachers, firefighters, hospital workers, people who had spent years being told there was nothing left, that the money was gone, that the case was lost, that the system had failed them. Elena sat in a community center in New Jersey 3 weeks after the verdict and listened to a retired schoolteacher named Ruth, 67 years old, 22 years in the classroom, describe what the stolen retirement savings had meant, what losing it had meant, what it had felt like to watch the case collapse year after year. Elena didn't say anything for a long time when Ruth finished. Then she said, "It's coming back. All of it. With interest." Ruth didn't cry. She was past crying. She just nodded slowly, the way people nod when something they'd stopped believing in finally turns out to be true. Martin Cole was granted formal whistleblower protection. The circumstances of his disappearance were reviewed by the FBI. No charges were filed. The investigators who examined the case quietly acknowledged that his assessment of the threat had been well-founded. 3 former Hargrove employees were charged with witness intimidation in connection with events from 2019. Martin Cole testified publicly for the first time in 5 years. He walked into a federal hearing room and sat down in front of a microphone and, methodically, in the same precise, careful way he had once documented every stolen dollar, told the complete story. Every transaction, every cover-up, every person who had known and said nothing. The room was silent the entire time. When he was done, the committee chairman, a senator who had been in Washington for 30 years and had seen most things, looked at Martin Cole for a long moment and said, "Mr. Cole, why didn't you come forward sooner? Why the years of silence?" Martin Cole considered the question. "Because I needed the right moment. And the right person." Elena was in the audience. Their eyes met across the room. She thought about every morning for 2 years, the 6 a.m. pickup, the coffee already waiting, the quiet drives through a waking city. She thought about how many times she had muttered case details in that back seat, not realizing she was talking to the only person alive who understood every word. She thought about page 47. $300 million in 4 years of her life, and it had come down to a single overlooked page in a binder. A page written by a man who had trusted her enough to wait, who had sat quietly in a driver's seat and watched her fight, and decided somewhere along the way that she was worth trusting with the truth. 2 months after the verdict, on a cold December morning, Elena walked out of her building at 6 a.m. There was a car waiting. She stopped. Martin Cole was standing beside it. "You didn't have to," she started. "Old habit," he said simply. She looked at him for a moment. Then she laughed, a real laugh, the exhausted, disbelieving kind, and got in the car. They drove through the city as it woke up. No music, no conversation, just the familiar quiet that had been, she now understood, the most important silence of her career. After a while, she said, "What do you do now?" He thought about it. "I think," he said slowly, "I testify, as many times as they need me to, for as many cases as I can help with." A pause. "There are others like Hargrove out there, Elena. You know that." "I know," she said. "Then I suppose," he said, "we have work to do." She looked out the window at the city passing by. $300 million. 4 years. 2 years of mornings. 1 page. 3 words. Check page 47. And everything changed. Here's what I want you to think about. For 2 entire years, Martin Cole sat 3 feet behind Elena Marsh every single morning. He heard everything. He saw everything. He knew exactly which page held the key to the whole case. And he said nothing. Not because he didn't care, because he was watching, waiting, measuring whether she was the person worthy of what he'd spent 5 years protecting. Most people in that courtroom never looked twice at the driver. He was quiet. He was older. He blended into the background perfectly. That's exactly what he needed them to think. The most dangerous person in any room isn't always the loudest one. Sometimes they're the one driving the car. If this story hit different, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you're new here, subscribe, because we tell stories that stay with you. See you in the next one.